Now that's how you take the score. And hello, I wanted to introduce you to something a little different in this video. Instead of me just playing some old games randomly, I wanted to take the time to talk about a project I've been working on. This is Invasion of the Emerald Sources, a new game I've written for the Spectrum Next. Ever since I got my Next at the end of mid-2020, so nearly 3 years ago, I've really wanted to write something on it. I've been really excited for what it offers over other micros, or I'm going back to original vintage hardware. And I know that that's probably going to disappoint a bunch of you. There would be a lot of people who would be bandying about Sam Coupe comments, thinking that there. But for me, it really comes down to 3 reasons. One is it's a learning experience. I have not really done a lot of dedicated programming on vintage kit, like modern vintage kit or vintage kit. And being able to do something that feels a little more lower level than what I'm used to for stuff I've done in my day job and whatnot, it's actually kind of exciting. It's been quite different to write a game on something like this. Granted, in BASIC, not full on assembler, but I find it has been quite a rewarding thing. As well, there is really the fact that the Next actually, I could go all the way down to real vintage hardware, and that's like this is sort of a step above. And so it still offers a lot of things that work really nicely. The biggest example is sprites. The Next can throw 128 of them on screen at a time. So you can have 128 sprites on screen. I just did some back to the napkin calculations with my code here, and I'm potentially using maybe 30 to 40. And it makes that really easier to manage when you're making stuff happen. That's sort of the main thing. So what this video is going to be about is I'm going to sit down and just walk through a bunch of aspects of developing, what it took to develop this game, what it was like. This is not going to be a walkthrough of the code at a line-by-line level. I'm actually going to provide documentation with the game download itself. This is a free game, though you can donate, pay what you want if you want to support future projects. Now, I'm going to break this down into small chunks, sort of inspirations, background, why I did it, some of the challenges of making it, and some of the tooling and aspects of that, and of course a little discussion on what comes next. So I'll be back in a tick and we will get started. What is Invasion of the Emerald Sources? Invasion of the Emerald Sources is an arcade style game. It's very much inspired by things like Asteroids and Space War and Computer Space and things like that. In fact, when I started out, my goal when starting this project was to try and make an Asteroids game or something inspired by it in pure NextBASIC. What I found very quickly on is that wasn't quite feasible, and we'll get into some of that in some of the challenges. So what happened was the design evolved and played around a bit. You understand as we show it off. So the gameplay is fairly sort of simple at its core. You take charge of a little spaceship and you just need to fly around and shoot the alien sources. Alongside that, there are bonus pickup pods that you will collect. The idea is you collect those for points. They are an increasing bonus until they reach their max total. And if the enemies shoot them or run into them, that will reset. As you destroy enemies, they'll also increase, the points you get will increase. And so really racking up the game's about racking up a high score, and the best way to do that is to make sure you don't die. It's not a very complex game. And for a first project, it makes sense for that to be the case. So, I wanted to have something that was small and focused. A lot of my energy on working on this was really to focus on the learnings, understanding the Next hardware a bit better, understanding NextBASIC and how NextBASIC's idiosyncrasies work. Again, some of these are going to come back later, and also really like tools and pipeline, so that it's 2023. We don't really. I know some people actually enjoy sitting in front of the vintage machine to write programs, but I wanted to use modern stuff. I wanted to use modern tools for art, for audio, version control, which didn't quite work, and other things like that. So my overall goal was really to make sure that I could sit down and to make sure that I can sit down and have a process that is portable, that, you know, I can work whether it's my PC in the house, my Mac when I'm out and about or whatever. So having options to do that. That's sort of really that. I guess the next topic really is about wrangling the Next, as I call it. And I'm sure if you're someone who has dabbled with NextBASIC in a more than trivial way, you're probably familiar with what I'm about to talk about, because performance was the problem. Essentially, a lot of this is on me for not really understanding a lot of the quirks of the language. This particular dialect of BASIC has some oddities around things like line numbering. If you read any guide out there, you really need to watch how you structure your program. Putting the stuff that gets called more often earlier in the listing, because then the runtime, the interpreter, will take less time to look it up when it comes to actually running and executing the code. I don't think I quite nailed this down pat. I did a bunch of reorganization as development went on, especially as we got to the later stages of it, but really wanted to make sure of that. There are also other things I know I haven't done that I could do, like replacing 4 next loops with repeat loops, getting rid of more go-throughs. I got rid of a bunch, a lot of restructuring to avoid that, but not quite all of them. And really, this is one of the things that, despite having a pretty decent manual, the Next's manual wasn't quite thorough enough here. And it also, you know, there's also the thing that with upgrades to the Next ZX OS since the machine's launch, there are a bunch of things that were added that aren't in the original manual. So I actually stopped using the paper manual and rely on the electronic copy, because I can also have the supplement open that talks about one of the really important things for making action games work in NextBASIC is the automatic sprite management system. Essentially, this lets you write a one-line call, and you can have a sprite just move under the control of the hardware without you having to iterate on it. This essentially is what made the performance here possible. Another example of sort of why this mattered is, originally, when I was channeling the Spirit of Asteroids, I wanted to have bullets fly around the screen, wrap around the screen. The check to do that, even though I was only checking like maybe 1 or 2 bullets every tick, I wouldn't call it frame, because we're not running anywhere near 50 frames per second here. We're running between 16 to 25 from my analysis. But just doing that check of saying, is this less than the min bound or greater than the max bound wrap around, that was enough to put quite a hit on it. So really, by the end of it, I sort of found myself taking things away from the design when they honestly were going to impact the development. Like it was sort of like I was a bit of a slave to performance once I sort of had the game running. I would wish I wasn't. There were a lot of ideas I tried that I wanted to add that I couldn't quite get working, or get working without being as hard a hit on the hardware as it was. And that's sort of one of those things. So yeah, I mean, I would love to. One idea I wanted to have was have a little bit of chasing of the UFOs. They might program to go down a vertical or horizontal path, but have them sort of influenced a bit by trying to move towards the player. Something like that for a little challenge. I've had to compensate for the challenge with increased speed, increased numbers, and things like that. And as I'm recording this, I haven't really, like, what you're seeing is close to a final version of the game. It'll be close to the one that you can download, but there's still a little bit of tweaking to be done. I want to try and do a little more bits and pieces before I could say this is finished and this is ready for release. So again, performance is sort of the big thing here, and I think if you are interested, you know, if you have an X and want to actually learn at writing games on it, that's sort of a thing you have to be mindful of. Think about your game designs, because you're not going to be able to produce games in pure NextBASIC up to the standard of the top tier commercial releases, the big names. So Baggers, Warhawk, Tiverian, Bikers, Delta Shadow, you know, stuff I've shown on the channel in the past. Some of the other games are out there. The big top tier ones are either full assembler or compiled BASIC. And that's honestly something I'll touch on in a bit. Tooling. One of the interesting things about tooling, about building this, was, again, I wanted to not do it on the machine itself. There are some great graphic packages. There's one that's just got a major update. I haven't used it, that runs native, that's supposed to be really good. For me personally, in terms of drawing sprites and backgrounds, I effectively used AE Sprite on my PC on my Mac. Put that into palletized mode, drew, exported that, and then I used the online tool from Remy, which essentially lets you build a sprite bank by drag and dropping images. For me, that worked really well because, particularly for handling the rotation, so having a player sprite that rotates. Originally, when I was focused on the goal of trying to be asteroids, I actually prepared 8 rotation frames to do 32 rotations, because the way, if you haven't read up on this stuff on the Next, you have the ability to, you have a sprite, so we have my hand, and that's sort of your first angle, and then I drew like several angles. I drew 8, but to covering those rotations to 90, because then you can also flip and rotate. So you would do the first set of angles from 0 to 90, you rotate, goes 90 to 180. Then at 180, you flip and you rotate, and you get your patterns. So you don't lose a huge number of sprites in the bank. I have to admit, in retrospect, knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't have gone for 32. Actually, I probably would have done things quite a bit differently, and I think I wouldn't have gone for an asteroid style control scheme, because that also, I think, could have been simplified, and then I would have been able to do sort of a classic 8-way thing that works on a joystick. One limitation is that effectively you've got to use, if you're playing on joystick, you've got to use a Mega Drive pad. You can use keyboard, and the game actually plays quite well on keyboard. I made sure of that, but you can't use a regular, I don't have one in reach, a regular, Atari, Commodore style Spectrum, the traditional joystick that you'd use if you're playing classic Spectrum games. You're not really going to have that here, unfortunately. It's just, my focus was on sort of having that experience. Again, I probably would have designed it differently and made it more compatible. Knowing what I know now, nearly 2 months later, than what I'd done at the start. So tooling. Effectively, when I started out, I was actually writing on the Next. Well, actually, I was writing on C-Spec, one of the better known emulators for the Next. The reason for that is, at the time, I wanted to be able to easily just doing it on the PC, having everything there. So, having the docs, having my notes, all of this stuff handy, easy to write to just manage writing the code. And then when I was happy, I would copy the program onto the SD card, run it on the hardware. Eventually I learned about the existence of a couple of utilities that come in the distribution, text to BAS, BAS to text. Those effectively take your listing or your program and spit the other version out. And so what I was able to do was I took my basic listing, spat it out as text, put it on the PC, edited natively, which basically meant I could use a text editor that let me copy and paste lines, that let me see more of the listing on screen. It's currently just shy of 500 lines of code. That includes some game data for levels and rotation values. So there's a lot of program here. Seeing the game in action, it doesn't look like a complex game, but there's a lot of it in action. That really meant things worked quite nicely to just get it onto get the process going. And I believe there's a PC version of that utility out there, which I'd probably more look into, just for the idea of saving a little bit of time with the processing. But the pipeline I have right now, I'm pretty happy with. The only real downside is that I rely on tools that are Windows only, and I really wanted to be able to work on it on the PC, work on it on the Mac, and didn't quite get version control for that stuff working either. So the actual code itself is pretty handy. Text to BAS, when doing that, when processing it, did actually do a decent job of giving you errors for when you did have problems in your listing. So I was able to sit down and quickly fix those. and that getting that iteration time wasn't quite as low as I'd like, quite as what I'm used to in working with engines like Unity, but it was still pretty decent to work with for the sake of this project. The next part of that is graphics. I sort of touched on this earlier. I used AE Sprite to pencil my images, fed those into Remy's tool, boom, and that all worked well. There are primarily, I'm primarily sprite based here. A lot of the, what you see on screen here is a bunch of sprites for the ships, the player, the pickups, the bullets, even the HUD, and even that game over logo you can see in the middle of the screen. That's also sprite based. But I do have a background in layer 2 for the starfield and also for the title screen. So there's 2 sprite banks, 2 backgrounds for the game screen here. And again, those utilities were pretty easy to process. You feed for the sprites, you just load the palette. You don't even need to load the palette for the sprite. You can just drag and drop the sprites. You need the palette for the bitmaps processing, but it still worked pretty smoothly. Worked great. Having a consistent palette. Now, I could probably have used 16 color sprites instead of 256. That's sort of a limitation of something I don't. Changing my process a bit later, particularly at least around making palettes. I downloaded someone else's that was all the system ones. In retrospect, again, I'd like to have my own palette and use that, because especially some of the other ideas I want to make would be more efficient with all of that. Again, that side of it, I feel like the process worked pretty smoothly. The last bit of this really is sound, and sound wasn't as smooth as graphics, unfortunately. Sound effects on the app was pretty solid. There's the AYFX player, again by Remy, that you load the bank in and you just call it with simple driver calls in the code. It worked really nice. Generating sounds was a little harder. Now, I have to admit, this is the first time I've sat down in anger with the AY sound chip and actually done anything with it. I've played around with bits on the 64 SID, a bit with the Pokey on the Atari computers, but not really with the AY. So understanding how it generates sound was definitely a challenge. And like I felt when I was using the tools, Remy's AY FX tool, which runs in the browser, and you just drag the sliders and then do all that stuff to get your sound. I felt like I was plugging numbers in, and I wasn't like this sound, like, because effectively with the AY you've got noise and you've got I guess it's tone, and you sort of manipulate those to do your sounds in various ways. So I didn't quite understand that relationship, and so I was sort of playing it by ear. Does this sound good enough? Is this okay? Things like that. It definitely was a learning experience, and for me there's a lot more that I would like to go back to with that in the future, so that when I work on the next game I can do a better job with the sound. In the event I don't have access to someone to do that for me, you know, one of those things about projects like this is I am trying to sort of do it mostly solo, just for, you know, personal resource reasons and learnings. The second part of that was music. I hadn't really thought about music until fairly late on, and so it was under the suggestion of someone that I looked into maybe doing the kind of background pulses that you got in like Space Invaders or Asteroids or some of those earlier arcade games. And so I had bought a copy of NextBASIC, which is a great music composition package for the Next that lets you, you know, drive all 3 virtual AY chips and do all of that stuff. And though I sort of watched some tutorials and got the hang of using it and created something that worked, I had a real pain trying to get that to actually run. The driver just threw out some spurious errors, and it just made no sense at all for trying to troubleshoot. And so I had to just cut that. I may still try and put it in. This version doesn't have it. Maybe I'll go back and get it working. Again, in the time, I'm recording this a little bit of time before I actually release it. The reason for that is so I've got time to edit it together, not without panicking. Another option, I guess, is also, are there other music drivers out there? I don't really want to write like a play statement, because looking at the instructions to play was pretty complicated, and it sounds like it munges whatever's happening on the AY on existing sound channels. So if I had sound effects playing and I call a play statement, it might overwrite that. So I don't really want that. I want to have that stuff coexisting nicely. And that's really all the challenges of the tooling. Like, there is a lot to learn, but it seems to be okay in the end. The Next community has done a really nice job in sort of just making these things available, getting them out there, and being easy to pick up. Something else that really helped was the work of a chap going by the handle of Kevin3D. He's written some games in NextBASIC, and he's done the thing where he's included like a document breakdown of the code. And this is where I sort of picked up on some of the tricks here, like using learning about the AYFX driver, learning about some of these optimizations and whatnot. His games are some pretty cool ones. They're worth checking out if you haven't already done that. And they're a couple of bucks. You get the code and the documentation with it, and I think it's a great learning experience. And I really like that the community is doing things like that. I think that's really great for just helping spread the knowledge and letting more people get involved. You know, as I'm sitting here at this early April, we're still a few months off the issue 2 Kickstarter 2 machines reaching people's hands. And I think that it's 5,000 or odd from there, cross with the 3,000 odd from the first Kickstarter and Misters, Engos, or whatever else. You're not going to be able to, make a full-time living, but you're going to be able to you could earn some beer money. And I don't have a problem with charging for stuff that's up there. The top tier stuff is amazing, definitely worth paying money for, but of course your mileage might vary. And I guess what's next for me with this? So I'm going to get this out the door, and you'll have this video when the game's available to download from my itch.io page, link in the description. So what's next? Well, I'll probably look into doing some bug fixes and stuff based on feedback and tweaks. I haven't had much of an opportunity to send it out to people. I've mostly just showed this at a couple of local events, gotten some little bits of feedback, but that's more observational feedback than direct player feedback. I've been talking with a few people in my Beyond the Scanlines Discord who have offered some nice suggestions in that. Thanks to those folks. But I'm mostly going to see what people think when it actually comes out. My first goal after that is to look into porting it to the Mega 65. I have had a Mega 65 here for a couple of months now from the second batch of machines, and I'm interested in seeing how well that handles it, how well its basic, handles it. I've seen some pretty cool things so far with the community discs, and so I'd like to try and port this over and see, maybe with some of these refinements, and see if the machine can handle it as well. One of the things I'm sort of interested in as well is going beyond basic. I feel that for the kinds of games I want to write, I don't think pure NextBASIC is good enough without dramatically simplifying it. Like, I would love to have had the UFOs have a bit more dynamic movement. I would love to have been able to have the wraparound. I'd like to be able to have a lot more happening. And I sort of butted heads against NextBASIC quite a lot in making this game. So the next point for me is other options. And there are two that are on my cards right now. The first, of course, is using the Boreal Basic Compiler, which has some pretty impressive results. I mean, look at Bikers, which was a game written in that compiler and runs incredibly well on Next hardware. I'm very excited by that, and I think that might be nice for just having high performance. Like, it's still relatively high level, it's still relatively easy to work and modify, but you get a lot more performance out of it, and that's something that interests me quite a lot. The other option, of course, is let's go to the metal and go for full-on assembler. Now, there are some pros and cons with that. Obviously, the big pro is you're going to get way more speed out of it, and that does excite me a heck of a lot. But at the same time, there's definitely a lot more complexity involved. I originally did start watching Jim Bagley's assembler tutorials, but I got a little overwhelmed with them. The format wasn't great when you're coming in like a year or two later, and you're on the other side of the world from when they were being live streamed, so you can't really interact in real time. I'm probably tempted to go back, reset up Odin, make sure I've got an up-to-date version of Odin installed, and try and do it all again and see how we go. I really like the idea of being able to use lower level stuff. Of course, you know, the Next has its variation, its extensions on the Z80 stuff, and you can't really port that stuff back to an original Spectrum. I don't know, I kind of like I like having hardware sprites, I'm not going to lie. I like hardware sprites, especially if you can get pixel accurate collisions. This doesn't. NextBASIC only lets you do bounding boxes. That's one thing I would love to work out if I could do in Assembler or in Boreal or whatever. Being able to do pixel accurate collisions just works better for the kinds of games that I personally want to make on the machine. A lot of these fast-paced arcade games really need pixel accurate collisions. I really like the idea of that, and of course, I'm happy to talk about my adventures with this stuff if you're all interested. You know, if as I do updates, I will do it. You know, this has taken a lot of energy from making normal game retrospective videos, but I've been feeling a little burnt out on that front for a while, and I've sort of gotten a little spark back in wanting to work on writing code. Ultimately, one of the big things that will help is just be willing to be outside your wheelhouse a bit. I've really enjoyed doing that, like working on a machine I don't know much about, working on stuff I haven't really played around with much, and I've had a lot of fun with it. So I hope you do take the chance to check out Invasion of the Emerald Sources. It's, like I said, it's a free pay what you want download. If you download for free and have a blast, that's cool. If you're willing to throw a few bucks my way, I greatly appreciate it, and it will be helpful for future projects. I think I've run out of notes. So, yeah, check it out. If you don't have an actual Next, you can use C-Spec. It is a little slower under emulation, but it works. You can, of course, you know, stuff like Mister. The Next core is functional. It's not quite as good as a real Next because of some architectural things between the real Next hardware and Mister, but it still works, and this plays pretty well on it. There are plenty of options out there, and it's worth having a look at and, you know, trying something a little different. And if it's not for you, then it's not for you. But, you know, it's Space Year 2023, and I think as enthusiasts of games on old hardware, we should be more open to what hardware we enjoy and stuff. Yeah, so that's it from me. So thank you all very much for sitting through this. I hope you learned some stuff. Like I said, I didn't want to focus on the nitty-gritty code level. That is going to be in some documentation with the actual release. If not at release, it'll be shortly after. My goal is to make sure that at least you can walk through the code and get an idea of how it all works and a good understanding of it. So of course, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks you to the channel's Patreon supporters. Thanks to the folks on the Discord for you know, some advice and feedback. If you're interested in any of that stuff, it's all in the video description. So with that, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you next time.